Hello, thank you all for coming. My name is Cindy Sanford. I'm the registrar at the Clark County Museum. Before I get started, let me tell you a little bit about what that means. Um, basically, I keep track of the stuff that the museum has. The museum collection contains everything from photos and documents to archival material, objects, and of course, if you've never been to the museum, you may not know, we also have historic houses and structures here on the grounds. So my background is I have a master's degree in anthropology with a certificate in museum studies, and I started my first job as a museum registrar it was the year 2000. So I've been doing this for 26 years. I've been at the Clark County Museum since 2013. So the Clark County Museum is a local history museum. It's in Henderson. If you've never been there, you should definitely come check it out. It was started as the collection of a woman named Anna Roberts Parks, who moved to Las Vegas in 1905. She went to mortuary school and eventually opened Palm Mortuary, which now is a huge chain of mortuaries around the valley. And she was an avid collector in pretty much everything you can think of. She was a big rock hunter, like you could see in these pictures, but she also collected antiques and clothing and just about everything. She had her own little museum building in an Army surplus barracks building near 21st and Fremont, and she would open it to people to come see it. Unfortunately, she died in 1962 and left her collection to her daughter, Edith Jennings Mariano, who started looking around for funds or sponsors to turn the collection into a museum. Finally, they suffered several break-ins, and so that really gave her the push she needed to find a place. The City of Henderson and the Chamber of Commerce of Henderson decided to take on the collection. They located it in one of the original BMI town site in Henderson School Gymnasium. Here's some pictures of that. And then the building was condemned and the city couldn't run the museum anymore. So the county, Clark County and the city of Henderson worked together to move us to Boulder Highway. We were down almost to Railroad Pass at the end of Boulder Highway. And the county got the land from the city and took it over as the museum. The first building here was the historic Boulder City Train Depot. This was down at Boulder City when they were building the dam. Unfortunately, the city wanted to preserve it, but they just, couldn't. That takes a lot of money and a lot of political will. And we needed to have a building here, and so we took it over. We still get some people from Boulder City who are a little spicy about that, but at least we got it preserved. So eventually more historic structures moved out here, and in the 90s, we opened an exhibit building. The museum's mission is to collect and preserve the history and natural history of Southern Nevada and to present that history through exhibits and educational programs. So we have here our main exhibit that talks about, the area from when it was basically underwater until the early days of gambling. So we do permanent exhibits like at the houses. We also have the Howard W. Cannon Aviation Museum at the airport. If you've ever killed time at the airport by looking at our exhibits, we run that too. And then we do a lot of changing exhibits. Here are some of the ones we've had over the years. Obviously, if we're going to fulfill our mission, we need to do that by acquiring collections. So most of what we have are donations from people who live around the area. We do have some things that we purchased over the years, but it's almost all donations. We are supported by so here's some of our collections, sorry. We are supported by a nonprofit group, the Clark County Museum Guild, and they are important to this story because in April of 2014, the Guild purchased a bunch of books and photographs from a bookstore called Academy Fine Bookstore. There are over 350 photographs and the negatives in that collection. And about 200 of those were from a family who was here on the pictures here. William Apfel, aka Bill Martin, is the man in the pictures, and he was the owner of a brothel in Nye County. So we started to do some research on the photos, try and figure out more information. And as I did that, I realized I didn't know anything about brothels in Nevada. I didn't know anything about the law. I didn't know about the history. So this was a great reason to get me to do that research. So before we talk about that particular brothel and the photos in the collection, I do want to do a brief history of legal prostitution in Nevada. And disclaimer before we get started, I am not an expert. This is all research I've done through books and stuff online, newspapers and things like that. So if you are looking for a really good history of legal prostitution or specific stories, I do have listed at the end of my presentation my sources. So I, lead you towards those because I find this very interesting and I've, found a lot of information, but I'm by no means expert. So the first law in Nevada that addressed prostitution was passed in 1881. This law was called the Town Board Act, and basically what it did was it gave county commissioners the rights to license, tax, regulate, prohibit, or suppress all houses of ill fame. So that was already a little bit odd that it wasn't just making them illegal, it was basically putting it on a county to county basis. And that was kind of how things went for quite a while. But during World War II, we started having a lot of military bases in Nevada, and the federal government demanded that prostitution be stamped down in areas around those bases. They didn't want all of the issues that go along with having brothels near bases full of single military men. After the war, control returned to the counties, but that was a good reason for Las Vegas and Reno to sort of take a less tolerant stance. So they started closing down the brothels. And that is why even now you won't find brothels in Las Vegas or Clark County or I'm sorry, Carson City and Reno. And we'll get into that a little bit more later. So at this time, Nevada had no statutes barring prostitution. But in 1949, it was ruled that brothels could be considered nuisances, which were condemned by common law. When this was upheld by Supreme Court, the state Supreme Court, it became basic law. So at this time, remember, the counties could control the brothels, and if they wanted to shut them down, they could do it by considering them as public nuisances. So in 1970, things were kind of the same for like 20 years. Brothel owner Joe Conforti convinced Story County to legalize brothels by recommending high taxes and fees and creating a licensing process. Now, Joe Conforti was definitely a character. He wrote a book. There are other books written about him. I believe he may still be alive, hiding in South America because he owes tax money. And his brothel was actually taken over by the federal government for a while. So for a brief time, the government ran a brothel. But anyway, that's an aside. So he was sort of the push behind legalized brothels in Nevada. Various court cases, of course, followed this, and eventually it was upheld by the Supreme Court in 1973 that they were licensable. In the meantime, brothels were added to the tax code in 1971, and as we all know, once things are added to the tax code, they're there to stay. So rural counties immediately started to regulate brothels, and by 1978, 3 counties had followed Story County in legalizing their brothels. And by 1980, 5 counties had legalized brothels, and 3 of those actually put it to the voters to decide, and the voters decided they wanted legal brothels. So this led state lawmakers to ban legalized prostitution in counties with more than 200,000 people. This was basically a way of keeping it out of Las Vegas and Carson City as well. Throughout the 1980s, the laws were further refined, making it illegal for counties to close brothels under the public nuisance laws. So that law from 1949 was eventually overturned. But what that meant realistically was unless a county specifically bans brothels, they can't be shut down spuriously, let's say. There were laws on advertising for and locations of brothels, and they've been refined and challenged and changed over the years. Basically, a lot of the advertising rules say they can't advertise basically along highways and public roads, and we will get to the restrictions on locations in just a minute. So in the meantime, they changed the state law to prohibit prostitution in counties with more than 700,000 people because some of the smaller counties were getting a larger population. So the state also mandates brothels cannot be within 400 feet of churches or schools or fronting on a principal business street in any town. So you're never going to drive through a town and find, the bank, the post office, and a brothel. They're going to be, kind of tucked away. So Nye County, who we're going to be talking about a lot today, is even more strict. They say 500 yards from churches or schools, 300 yards from any public streets, and 300 yards away from private residences or businesses without their consent. So you don't have to worry about a brothel moving in next door if you don't want it. So prostitution is legal in Nye, Mineral, Churchill, Elko, Lyon, Story, Humboldt, Lander, White Pine, and Esmeralda counties. And it is illegal in Carson City, Clark County, Washoe, Lincoln, Eureka, and Douglas counties. In Pershing County, it is only legal in incorporated towns, of which there's only one, Lovelock, population 2,000. There is not a brothel there at this time. So this map, these two maps are an example of what it was in 1973 and what it looks like in 2014, which is pretty close to what it is now. The red counties those are where prostitution is illegal. The yellow is where it's legal, and then the blue is where there are restrictions. And if you look at the map from 1973, you can see there are a few changes, but for the most part, it's kind of been the same. So as of 2025, there were 18 brothels in Nevada, which is much lower than it used to be. They're in 8 counties, and they employ about 200 women at any given time. The women come and go a lot at the brothels. And then they also employ even more staff like bartenders, cleaning people, security, and of course the madams and managers. So it's not a huge number of people, but it does make a lot of money, which again, we will get to. So here's a map that an enterprising road trip enthusiast made a few years ago that maps all of the brothels, and it's no surprise that most of them are around the interstate or the road between Las Vegas and Carson City. And again, if you are interested, here's a comparison to where they were in 1973. You can see not a ton of changes. So now we're going to do a rundown of the different brothels, which is really an excuse for me to show photos of them because it's fun to look at and interesting. So we're going to start with Nye County, the Alien Cat House we will get to, but they also have the Chicken Ranch and Sherry's Ranch. In Elko County, they have a few more. Here's Bella's Hacienda Ranch, the Dovetail Ranch, the one with my favorite name, Inez's Dancing and Diddling, Mona's Ranch, Sharon's Bar and Brothel, and Sue's Fantasy Club. And then we get to Lyon County, where we have the Love Ranch, the Moonlight Bunny Ranch, and the Sagebrush Ranch. And the Kit Kat Guest Ranch, which unfortunately suffered a serious fire in 2023 and has not opened up since then. White Pine County, we've got the Big Four and the Stardust Ranch. Lander County only has the Desert Club. And Mineral County and Story County each have one apiece, the Wildcat Brothel and the Mustang Ranch. I guess I should take this moment to say that this is a PG-13 presentation. This is the only level of nudity we will get to. So how does it actually work? So prostitutes are actually independent contractors who are employed by the brothels, and that means they split their fees with the brothel. It's usually a 50-50 split. Drivers who bring a customer to the brothels get between 10 to 30% of what that customer spends, and that is taken out of the prostitute's share of the fees. And then there are other expenses that go into it so that it usually ends up that prostitutes end up earning 20 cents on the dollar that they get from each customer. In Nye County, if you want to open a brothel, you have to pay an application/investigation fee, which is $5,000. And then if you're going to have more than one manager, it's another $1,500 for each. There's a license fee, depending on how many workers you employ. It could be as low as $2,300, but it could go all the way up to $47,000. And you'll notice that is per quarter, not per year. And then each prostitute has to pay a registration fee, which is $150 quarterly or $425 annually if you wanted to do that. And if you would like to become a prostitute, not only do you have to pay that, but you have to undergo an investigation, which usually includes a background check, interview with the applicant, interviews with employers and business associates of the applicant, and a background check on their finances. Applicants can be denied for any criminal past, and most counties also have vague wording about unsavory associates. This is in order to keep organized crime out of the brothels, which works to varying degrees of success. Prostitutes are checked weekly for sexually transmitted diseases and monthly for HIV. So in 1937, a law was enacted to require weekly health checks of all prostitutes, but testing didn't begin until 1986. And I guess you can probably imagine why it actually finally started in 1986, and that was the AIDS crisis. Since those mandatory health checks began, no full-time legal commercial sex worker has tested positive for HIV. By comparison, Metro has kept records of the HIV positive prostitutes that they have arrested over the years, and over 350 of them have tested positive for HIV. And legal prostitutes have a lower level of sexually transmitted diseases in general, lower than not only illegal prostitutes, but of the general population of women. They are, checked so regularly and that they are very safe. That's very important for the brothels because obviously that'd be the quick way to get them closed down if they were spreading diseases. In 2009, the Nevada State Board of Health added urethral examinations to requirements so that male workers could be tested. There was one male prostitute at that time at the Shady Lady in Nye County. He didn't last very long, only a few months. There was a really interesting article that a woman journalist paid for his services, but really just interviewed him and talked about it. And it was equal parts humorous and sad, kind of. So, and I think one other time a male prostitute worked in Nevada, but that didn't last very long either. Prostitutes must be at least 21 years old, except in Story and Lyon counties where they only have to be 18. So that's kind of where we were until we got to COVID. COVID was obviously hard on brothels, as you can imagine. State mandated their complete closure. It was for over a year in 2020 and 2021. During that time, some of the workers offered online dates and non-sexual escort services. And also during that time, at least one county, Nye County, waived the brothel fees during the shutdown. So at least they didn't have to keep paying the license fees and all the other things while they were not able to be in service. When they reopened, the brothels had similar restrictions to every other business. They used temperature checks. They wore masks in public areas. In the private rooms, it was up to the worker if she wore a mask because, as it was quoted by Kiki Lover from the Sagebrush Ranch, there are a few things we can't do with the mask on. Some brothels also tried to take advantage of government loans and other programs. Bella Comans of Bella's Hacienda Ranch applied for a Paycheck Protection Program loan. There was a lot of disagreement as to whether a brothel actually was qualified to get that loan. And by the time it was decided that she was, for the $70,000 loan she requested, the funds had run out. So she didn't actually get the loan. But once everything was back open, it was business as usual. They did take a hit like everything else after COVID. And one thing to keep in mind is that the laws around prostitution are still in flux. Last year, the state legislature passed AB 209, which would have provided immunity from criminal liability for reporting a crime while engaging in prostitution or solicitation for prostitution. So even if you were an illegal prostitute, you could go and report a crime without worrying about being prosecuted. Unfortunately, that was vetoed by the governor, so it did not go into law. And other states are starting to decriminalize prostitution. Maine decriminalized engaging in prostitution in 2023. And then earlier this year, the Colorado State Senate actually considered decriminalizing prostitution, but it never made it out of committee because of lack of support. But it is great to hear that this is a conversation that's going on. So in the future, there may be more legal prostitution in other states. And why is it great? Well, to be honest, it's the monetary benefits of prostitution. I'm going to throw a bunch of numbers at you. Some of these are outdated. They were just the ones I could find. In 2012, the Nevada Brothel Association estimated that brothels make about $35 million per year. The state does not tax brothels, even though the Brothel Association itself lobbied to do so. So the state receives no tax money, but it does receive fees from the business licenses necessary for each brothel. Again, in 2012, this was estimated at $120,000 per year. So not a huge amount of money considering the amount of money that's being spent. Just an aside, in 2009, a state senator pushed for a $5 tax per act of prostitution. I don't know how they were going to hold that accountable, but it was estimated that there are over 400,000 sex acts performed annually at brothels. This tax would have given the state $2 million. A similar discussion was held when Las Vegas Mayor Oscar Goodman pushed to legalize brothels in Las Vegas. Although this time the math came out a lot higher, they thought it would net the city almost $200 million per year in taxes. So individual counties and towns make money from the various fees and licenses, as I mentioned earlier. The amount varies obviously from county to county. The total revenue generated for counties in 2010, which was close to when my previous statistic, it was over $10 million. Nye County alone received almost or over $4 million from the brothels. In Lyon County, 30% of their discretionary budget comes from brothels. I pulled up this one because I really enjoyed, if you look at the Nye County, you can see the notable revenue usage. One of them was a museum, which I'm all for. So counties also save money through the presence of brothels. Local law enforcement agencies report that they spend less time and money. Most authorities say little time is spent at the brothels, at least on the clock. Tight control on drugs and alcohol consumption also help keep crime levels down. Regular health screening keeps the transmission of sexually transmitted diseases low, which also, I mean, it's better health in general, but also cuts down on healthcare costs that the counties have to cover. And then other businesses in the areas also benefit. Taxis and other car services depend on brothels. They bring in tourist dollars, and the employees themselves spend their money in the areas. And finally, many brothels give back to their communities through scholarships, charity events, and gifts to local organizations. Now, it's not all positive, obviously. Prostitutes are often taken advantage of by brothel owners, ignored by police, and treated as second-class citizens by the population in general. One prominent attorney in Nevada even suggested treating rape of prostitutes differently than rape of other women, obviously with less severe penalties. Prostitutes also have to pay for everything out of their share of money, as I discussed earlier, and that can sometimes get them in debt to the brothels, which is obviously a really sticky and negative situation. And despite claims that legalized prostitution reduced sex crimes, Nevada has a fairly high number of rapes, according to FBI statistics. So that doesn't really seem to pan out here. And of course, brothels make so much money for counties that they're sometimes allowed to run without oversight, putting the prostitutes in even more danger and leading to some serious crime, which we will get to. So that is a very brief history of legal brothels in Nevada. So let's go back to those photos that I talked about that the museum obtained. The only real provenance we had was the name Bill Martin and the fact that he owned a brothel at Amargosa Valley in Nye County. The photos included family photos, photos of local events, and vacation photos. We began to research the family and the brothel, and we found quite a bit of information about him, and you'll see why in a little while. So Bill Martin, whose real name was William Apfel, was born in 1919 in New York City. He served as a U.S. Army pilot during World War II. He worked as a truck driver and then a New York City police officer. In late 1952, he was fired from the New York City Police Department after being found guilty of extortion. So what happens when you get fired from the New York City Police Department? You move to Las Vegas. He moved here in 1953 with his wife, Sally Foster, and their son, Patrick. They bought a house in the area called Vegas Heights. He and Sally had a daughter, Cynthia, in 1956. One of the photos mentions our shop, so it's possible that they owned a store, but we couldn't find anything about that. And then he got a job as a Las Vegas police officer. That only lasted for a few months because then he got a job as a bouncer at Roxy's, an illegal Las Vegas brothel. Now, you may have heard of Roxy's before. It was pretty famous. It was owned by Eddie and Roxy Clippinger, located on Boulder Highway, an area called 4 Mile, because it was 4 miles from town. There were reports of all kinds of crimes and horrible things happening there. Dead bodies were allegedly removed from the premises in secret and, robbed from along the way. Clippinger bugged some of the rooms and even had a camera in one of them that he could use to blackmail people. And he had ties to at least 2 Clark County commissioners, Clark County Sheriff Glenn Jones and Lieutenant Governor Clifford A. Jones. An FBI raid in April of 1954, which is shown in this photo, shut the brothel down and sent Eddie and Roxy to jail. Sheriff Jones lost his next election and was investigated by a grand jury for his involvement in the brothel, as well as other dealings. So it's not really clear if Martin was still working at Roxy's at the time of the raid, but around the same time, he set up shop in a town called Lathrop Wells in the Amargosa Valley. Amargosa Valley is a desert area east of Death Valley and south of the Nevada test site in southern Nye County. You can see on the map here, it's on Highway 95. So if you've ever driven from here up to Carson City or Reno, you've driven by. Originally, it was a stop on the Las Vegas and Tonopah Railroad. For a while, there was a service station there. But the building that would become the brothel was originally a railroad station in Death Valley Junction and was later used as a school and possibly even a church. It was moved to Lathrop Wells and then added to, and we have several construction photos here in the collection. Eventually, it opened on St. Patrick's Day in 1957, which is why it was named the Shamrock. There's a few more pictures of it and also of the surrounding area. By 10 years later, in 1967, Martin also owned the Coach House Saloon, which was at the same intersection as the Shamrock. This is where some of our research was not conclusive. A local telephone directory said the Coach House was called Nick's Coach House in 1965 and owned by Nick DeCandia. And he is in a lot of the pictures. So it's unclear if he stayed on as the bartender or what exactly happened there. But Bill Martin did definitely own it. At any rate, now that the brothel was open, it was time to party. These photos are all from the collection. It's hard to tell if they're from the brothel or from the Coach House Saloon, but they do show everybody having fun. So Bill Martin was involved with several brushes with the police in Nye County, but was never actually charged. He appears to have been well connected in local politics, and he used what he learned at Roxy's to have close ties with the appropriate commissioners and sheriff and the people that you needed to run your brothel without too much interruption. This wasn't always enough. Now, this story comes from Joe Conforti, who I mentioned earlier, so it should be taken with a huge grain of salt. Because as I said, he was a character and his stories were a little outlandish sometimes. According to his story, Martin allegedly had ties to the mafia and was sent to Lathrop Wells to, quote, cool off. He got in trouble fairly soon, however, when 2 of the county commissioners tried to start a brothel north of Beatty, which later became Angel's Ladies. The district attorney, Bill Becko, however, had close ties to Martin, and according to Conforti, was somehow causing problems for the brothel, according to those commissioners. So they called Joe Conforti, and he convinced them to vote to make 3 and only 3 brothels legal in Nye County, which apparently would have left the Shamrock out. It's kind of unclear as to how that would have worked. But the law did pass, and according to all we could find, this was the first time brothels had ever been made explicitly legal in any county in Nevada. Like they actually said, 3 brothels are legal in this county. Again, not clear because the Shamrock was allowed to keep running. So this is a pretty confusing story, but it does kind of, but then what happened next was someone threw a Molotov cocktail through the window of the brothel in Beatty. Luckily, the fire was contained. If this story is true, it kind of forecasts what would bring down Bill Martin later. So 20 years later, a haul trucker named Walter Plankinton decided to start a brothel in Pahrump. He named it the Chicken Ranch after the famous Texas brothel. He originally was in city limits, and that didn't work out so well, and so he was kicked out of town, but he actually opened the brothel actually closer to Las Vegas. In 1978, it was burned down. The local police, according to some, didn't really help. Deputy Sheriff Glenn Henderson was in charge in the area, and according to the police later, he was told not to respond to the fire, and no investigation was really carried out. Sheriff Jay Howard, however, lost his bid for re-election, and after that, some of the police officers began to speak up about what was going on, and the FBI became involved. Eventually, in 1979, Martin was indicted with conspiring to burn down the chicken ranch. According to the indictment, Martin paid Albert Easley, James Jack Tatum, and Ken Collegier, who was Martin's partner at the Shamrock, $15,000 to burn the chicken ranch trailers. Martin was convicted of perjury in the eventual court case and sentenced to 5 years in prison and a $10,000 fine. Before he go to prison, however, on April 28, 1982, Martin was shot and killed by Gerald Asoff, possibly over a dispute involving Asoff's attempt to purchase the coach house that Bill Martin owned. During this dispute, Asoff also briefly kidnapped Martin's girlfriend, Beverly Nichols. Asoff was convicted, but the conviction was overturned due to prosecutorial misconduct. Just as an aside, his lawyer was Oscar Goodman. It appears that Asoff tried to fake his own death during the retrial, and he later moved to Arizona and died in 1987. So what happened to the Shamrock after Bill Martin's death? I could not find a lot of information about it in the 80s. It appears that Ken Collegier, his partner who helped burn down the chicken ranch, may have continued to run the brothel, and actually tax records in the early 80s show that he did own it. You can see there are postcards and photographs printed in 1987, which show the brothel, and it still has the name, the Shamrock. This is a postcard from 1987. And yes, you can get postcards from brothels in case you were looking for an interesting souvenir. Around the same time, a photographer named Timothy Horsley published a book of photos of Nevada brothels, including the Shamrock. And here are a couple of these. Again, this would have been the late 80s. I really like this one with the line of timers, one for each room, so they could keep track of how long customers were there. This book, by the way, was titled Brothels of Nevada. This photo was taken in the 80s, and if you look closely at that white car parked by the door, you can see the license plate NY003. This suggests to me, anyway, that the close relationship between brothel owners and local officials continued. So postcards aren't the only brothel souvenirs you could pick up. For decades, a line of brothel-themed liquor decanters were sold, including this one, first made in 1977. Eventually, local brothel owner Maynard Joe Richards purchased the Shamrock in 1988, and eventually, probably in the mid to late 90s, renamed it the Cherry Patch Ranch 2. He owned another brothel in nearby Crystal called the Cherry Patch Ranch, so this was his lack of imagination. Here's some pictures of the Cherry Patch 2. The building was added onto, and for a while part of it was a brothel museum. This was a common practice used by owners to try and get around those advertising restrictions we talked about earlier. You couldn't advertise for a brothel, but you could advertise for a brothel museum. The gas station and truck stop that was added to the site was named Nevada Joe's, and it stayed this way for over a decade. In 2006, however, Richard was indicted on 2 felony counts of federal wire fraud after bribing Nye County Commissioner Candace Trummel, who was working with the FBI. He pled guilty to one charge in 2009, somehow was allowed to keep his brothels for a while, but in 2010, he sold the Cherry Patch Ranch and Mabel's Whorehouse, and in 2011, the Cherry Patch Ranch 2, formerly the Shamrock, all to Dennis Hoff. Now, we've had some characters. We're going to have another one here. Dennis Hoff owned 2 brothels near Carson City, the Love Ranch North and the Moonlight Bunny Ranch. The Moonlight Bunny Ranch was the focus of an HBO documentary. called the Cat House, which led to two series, Cat House the series and Cat House 2, Back in the Saddle. By 2013, Hoff owned 7 brothel licenses in Nevada, the most ever by a single owner. In Nye County, Hoff renamed the original Cherry Patch the Love Ranch South. He had a brothel called the Love Ranch in northern Nevada. He renamed Mabel's Whorehouse Dennis Hoff's Cat House. And for the former Shamrock, Hoff worked with famous Hollywood madam Heidi Fleiss to create an extraterrestrial theme due to its proximity to Area 51. And it was renamed the Alien Cat House. The gas station truck stop was renamed the Area 51 Alien Travel Center. The Alien Cat House opened in 2012 as a small brothel with a license for 3 to 5 women. It made for a great field trip. I took an intern on where we bought our own postcard. Now, Hoff had a keen eye for advertising and propaganda and always managed to keep his brothels in the news, first with that reality show Cat House on HBO, and later by inviting celebrities to the brothels, which didn't always turn out well. I'm sure you remember basketball player and Khloe Kardashian's husband, Lamar Odom, OD'd at the Love Ranch brothel in Crystal. That didn't go so well. Unfortunately, Hoff died in 2018, shortly before he was elected a Nevada assemblyman for Nye County. While running for office, he did sell 2 of his Nye County brothels, including the Alien Cat House. The new owner, local businessman Raman Sharma, has kept the extraterrestrial theme, although the brothel did recently change its sign. Though small, the Alien Cat House continues to be important in the world of legal brothels. Last year, they hired Air Force Amy, whose real name is Deanne Salinger, who is very famous in the world of prostitution and porn and sex work and related things. She's a veteran of the Air Force who may have served at Nellis. I think she's claimed that before, but I've never found any proof. She's been working as a legal prostitute since 1990. And I'm going to list all of the brothels she worked at: the Chicken Ranch, the Mustang Ranch, the Cherry Patch Ranch, Sherry's Ranch, the Kit Kat Guest House, and the Moonlight Bunny Ranch before she moved to the Alien Cat House. And she was one of the featured women in the Cat House documentaries and shows. She doesn't work there very long, but she didn't work there very long, but she did bring a dash of excitement to the place. So as for Hoff's other brothels, in Nye County, the Love Ranch South was purchased by a staunch opponent of the brothel industry, Jan Jensen, who had it destroyed in late 2024, as seen in this photo from the Pahrump Valley Times. So, what started off as family photos led to a truly unique story, which includes many of the major players in the history of legalized prostitution in Nevada. We had Joe Conforti, we had Joe Richards, we had Dennis Hoff, even Air Force Amy. In its nearly 60 years of existence, the brothel shown in these photos has been tied to everything from arson and murder to reality TV and sci-fi themed sex. The museum can now tell the story of this brothel and the man behind its creation. As a sort of coda, let's talk about the future for legalized prostitution and brothels. Business is down. It's been down basically since 2008 and the economic downturn, and it's never really had a chance to recover. A lot of the issues are related to the availability of prostitutes online and in cities like Las Vegas. Many industry representatives blame law enforcement and casino managers for not cracking down on illegal prostitution in Las Vegas, which obviously hurts their business. A 2011 report shows that about 66 times more money is spent by customers on illegal prostitution in Nevada than in legal brothels. So that's why when Oscar Goodman was talking about charging a tax for acts of prostitution, it would raise so much money because there's just so much more money going into illegal prostitution than to the brothels. The future of brothels in Amargosa Valley, however, is pretty clear. Nye County restricts the number of brothels in Amargosa Valley to 1 or less. So as long as the Shamrock is there, there's not going to be any others. So whether it's called the Shamrock, the Cherry Patch, the Alien Cat House, or whatever it might be named in the future, it will be the only one there, and we'll have the photos of its history. So as I mentioned, not an expert. These are my sources that I use. I've broken them down into sources that are specifically about the Alien Cat House and also sources that are about brothels in Nevada. There's some really great information there. I highly recommend if you're interested to look up some of those. I'm going to leave that up for now, and hopefully you guys have a lot of questions.
Thank you, Cindy. If anybody has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat, and we can read them and answer any questions you have.
Yeah, and if I got anything wrong, let me know, because then I can fix it for next time.
A random little fact: the Shady Lady, which used to be one of the brothels in Nye County, is run currently as a bed and breakfast by a former site steward.
Wow. Is it still decorated as it was when it was a brothel?
I have no idea what it looked like as a brothel, but each of the rooms are themed and they're very pretty. So
Yeah.
who knows?
Yeah. I will say when we went on the field trip to the Alien Cat House, I can report that they do have themed rooms, including a probing room. So if that is something that's interesting. And I will say actually touring a brothel is really interesting. Sherry's Ranch in Pahrump does at least they used to. I don't know if they still do after COVID. They do a lot of tours for local organizations. I think Red Hat ladies go there on tours a lot. It is a really interesting, and they've kind of turned it into a little side hustle, I think, doing tours.
Hey, any questions at all? No?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for coming, Cindy, and presenting. This has been
Sure.
great. And it's nice to have this on record, like have this on our speaker series. Because Cindy has given this talk to us a couple of times over the 14 years I've been running this. So I'm very appreciative.
Yeah. Well, thank you for having me. Like I said, this is was a great reason for me to see what kind of changes have come about. I didn't know anything about, the COVID, how COVID affected brothels, so it was a good excuse to learn some more.